This talk is based around a paper that I think was published maybe, well, it's over a year ago. Anyway, but it's a paper I wrote with Jordan Beck, addressing the topic of interaction and what we mean by interaction, which itself is quite a complicated thing, but it's kind of responding to various conversations that are happening in the literature. So it's a kind of conceptual paper, I guess. I linked to the paper in the Teams chat, so if you want to read more about it, it's obviously much more in depth than the argument in the paper, so I'm trying to just present as much as I can now. So to begin with, I've got a kind of prelude, which is related to the paper, but more like sets the scene. So it's a bit like that kind of opening in Blade Runner, the film, if you've seen it, where you get to see this huge view of a complex city, but don't really understand exactly what's going on in it, but you get a kind of this kind of sense of something's happening out there. And that's what I want to start with, rather than delving straight into the argument. So I'm just trying to setting the scene to begin with. So I mean, some of you may be familiar with some of these arguments and discussions around HCI, but I'll just go through them anyway. A whole bunch of changes have been happening, as with any research field, particularly with HCI. A whole bunch of changes have been happening over time in HCI. I'm going to be talking about what these are, at least what I think they are. And these have created lots of kinds of turbulences in HCI and generated lots of discomfort, potentially, confusions, whatever. One of these kind of scene setting things is about multiplying communities in HCI and also significant participation shifts. So we've seen more and more communities come to be involved in HCI as a field. Chi is a good example. I'm using it as an exemplar, as anyone would, although there are alternative HCI communities that exist. The proliferation of subcommunities in the Chi conference is just one indicator of this, these kind of multiplying communities that exist in HCI and creates some various frictions. The other friction relates to this is to do with participation shifts. So whilst attendance at conferences like Chi have gradually risen over time, one of the biggest shifts that's happened is the rate of participation. So while attendance has gradually grown, participation has massively grown, and this creates certain kinds of frictions and turbulences in the community. There's also been a shifting sense of what the purposes of HCI are and whether it is a field, discipline, whatever. It's been commented on in various papers about a kind of the corelessness of HCI, a lack of shared topics, and also this is kind of expressed by people as I think I would call it kind of a desire for like a normal science of HCI. So there's some people in HCI who feel that there's a need for this kind of shared set of topics or whatever it might be. That creates another kind of friction in HCI. There's also been increasing intellectual differences in HCI as these kind of communities have come to take part in its research. It's been commented by, Von Rogers, for example, that HCI has been recasting its net ever wider. And this kind of has created a bunch of challenges around kind of normative senses of what HCI should be about and what counts as HCI. And you see this kind of coming out in people's discussions. And there's been a lot of redrawing constantly of boundaries and also some sense of territoriality. So what counts as HCI is a territorial question. Some policing around what should be or shouldn't be an HCI has been going on too. This turns to other discussions or relates to other discussions around things like waves and turns or paradigms as kind of historical narratives that people apply to thinking about what HCI is. And this obviously also implies, in some of the discourse at least, obsolescence, so that we're done with some of these earlier notions of what HCI is about and obviously what interaction is about. So things like, as you can see in the diagram here, which I've just taken, I'm not sure where it's from, we're moving from kind of some early cognitive modeling through to things like considering emotion and embodied interaction and user experience and so on. And so this kind of discourse of waves, terms and paradigms and so on, knowingly or not, tends to create senses of obsolescence, and people kind of kick back against that. Then there's been finally kind of conflicts between ideas of academia and industry and their participation in HCI, conflicting orientations, priorities, norms and cultures, as depicted by this protest at the last CHI in Glasgow. Not the last CHI, 2019 CHI, because the last CHI didn't obviously physically happen. But this protest against kind of the roles of industry sponsors in HCI. So there's lots of questions going on around who is or should be steering HCI communities, and this plays into this general picture of turbulence within HCI. So that's my kind of prelude. Now I want to move to part one of the discussion around what interaction is. So I want to turn to this idea of an interaction debate, or a debate about interaction. But before I start, I just want to say that this is a complex discussion, and I'm turning it into a bit of a binary for rhetorical purposes. But of course, it's a big sea of discussion around interaction, so it's worth bearing in mind. So I've been starring interaction here, and I want to talk about what I mean by that. So I'm talking about the concepts of interaction in HCI. I'm not concerned precisely about what it is we're necessarily meaning when we're saying interaction. I'm not talking about a specific concept of interaction. I'm talking about the concepts of interaction. So I'm bracketing interaction, and the discourse of interaction is what I'm interested in. The stories we tell ourselves about what interaction is, and kind of the conceptual and kind of language problems that arise from that. One of the key papers discussing this is a paper by Alex Taylor from 2015 called After Interaction. It's in the Interactions magazine. And in the paper, he expresses some discomfort with notions of interaction in HCI being capable of helping us understand some of the challenges around digital technologies in the present day and into the future. So one of the examples he gives is of the Boris bikes, so-called Boris bikes in London, a network of hireable bikes, and the kind of challenges in describing how people are experiencing and using these bikes, but also how they connect with other stakeholders and so on, perhaps areas of deprivation versus more affluent areas in London, the unequal distribution of these bikes, and how they interact, or how these bikes and the network of bikes and their use interacts with, as he says, various social, technical, scientific, intellectual, organizational, political and ethical worlds. And as I said, he's expressing in the article, some discomfort around the use of the term interaction to talk about these phenomena. He also talks about the kind of conventional way that interaction has been thought of in HCI, and he references the mother of all demos here, which is a very, very famous demonstration from Doug Engelbart and a bunch of others in the early part of computing. If you're not familiar with it, go to YouTube and look at a video of what they're actually demonstrating. But in short, Alex argues that Engelbartian interaction is has been the default mode of HCI and the default way of thinking about interaction, which prefigures, as he says, an interface foregrounding a very particular set of relations between user and computer. And as a concept, interaction hinges on an outmoded notion of technology and use. This is his argument, so maybe we should kind of dispense with it or rethink it in some way. This is my summary of his argument, that there are constraints to notions and concepts of interaction in HCI, that it struggles to talk about the enactment of different, what he calls worlds, through design and design's entanglement in them. And others also expresses some discomfort with notions of interactions. There's another article, it's not just Alex, called Beyond Interaction, which Verbeek talks about technological mediation as a kind of replacement way of thinking about what interaction is. And there's also other things you could talk about too, like QT and Bannon's notion of the practice paradigm, and they moving away from the interaction paradigm in HCI and CSCW And they talk kind of about, again, sort of this notion about this idea about maybe we should dispense with or get rid of the notion of interaction because it's holding us back. As I said, just a reminder, now I'm going to talk about the opposite side of the argument. Just a reminder, it's a sea of complex debate. It's not a single uniform discussion with two sides, but I'm going to treat it a little bit like that. So Antti and Casper have this paper called What is Interaction that some of you might have read, might be familiar with, from 2017. This is kind of a different view of interaction. It basically tries to schematize and summarize different views of interaction that we have in HCI, that are prevalent in HCI. So if we look at, these concepts of interaction, like interaction as dialogue, interaction as a kind of transmission, interaction as tool use, interaction as optimal behavior or embodiment experience. And then they go through all the kind of the ways in which these different notions of interaction are talked about in the literature and so on, these different concepts of interaction. And they try to create a schema for how to organize them. Some of these you'll be very familiar with. So, Norman's Gulf of Evaluation and Execution fits into the dialogue side of things, I think. Information foraging theory is about kind of interaction as a kind of optimizing activity. And of course, we think about kind of embodiment, interaction in terms of embodiment. So, how we are in the world, how we be in the world. And again, sort of what their critique is, or at least their motivation seemingly for doing this, is to move away from what they call folk notions of interaction to definition by schematizing concepts of interaction. That's what that kind of table's about. They're not the only ones to be talking about this. You can also look at work by Lars-Erik Janler and Eric Stolterman. They have a book that's a few years, 3 years old, that talks about, an article that's a few years old. They also have a book called The Elements of Interaction, Things That Keep Us Busy. But they're, talking about some proposals and for definitions of measures of interaction. They have some models of interaction, kind of what they mean by interaction. And they make this comment in this book, the things that keep us busy. I'll just read out quotation. Vagueness of interaction would not be very surprising if it were just the idea of the general public, but even among researchers and experts in human-computer interaction, a field of research and development with interaction in its very heading, a deep, crisp, shared understanding is wanting. So they're also expressing a kind of desire for some definitions, schemas, just like Antti and Casper are. Here's just another example from Doubley et al. So this is an article from Interactions talking about different types of interactions. Again, kind of trying to produce some schemas or definitions of what kind of interactions we actually mean when we're talking about interactions. So my sort of summary of this other side of the argument, rather than sort of dispensing with interaction, some people want to sort of define concepts of interaction and ways of talking about interaction. And these are responses to two different things. I guess there's some sense of interaction being underdefined, which is one way of thinking about it, or that kind of it relies on too much in the way of kind of common intuitions. And these are kind of arguments to kind of against moving beyond interaction or after interaction. I think also there's a tendency in this sort of view to be essentially doing something about disciplinarity and disciplining HCI to kind of ways to fit things together so that we become more of a respectable discipline that is easily communicable, rather than this complex sea of understanding of what interaction is and so on. So I think that there's a reaction going on there too. So I just want to make my own discussion a little bit more problematized, my own distinctions problematized. I've already suggested that, definers versus dispensers itself is a bit of a binary. It's more complicated than that. And also kind of readings of the kind of construction progress orientation of HCI. So this idea of, as I mentioned earlier, about, waves, paradigms and turns, can be taken to imply that interaction is to be dispensed with. So we're going beyond interaction, we're going, after interaction. And you could see that the definitional kind of work that I mentioned, the opposition to a dispensing argument, is an attempt to sort of defend against that potential implied obsolescence when we move beyond interaction to retain interaction. There's also an element of kind of some straw man arguments in all of this, some use of provocative titles where it may be not warranted, and so on. And but at the same time, definitional work is still disciplining work. It's all about doing some discipline to construct a discipline, and dispensing as a reaction to perhaps being disciplined by some of these people who want to define what interaction is. Now I want to move to the second part, which is arguing for interaction, for the value of interaction, the concepts of interaction. So kind of stepping back from this debate. So this view of interaction that I'm sort of proposing is that it's primarily a kind of language or conceptual problem that we can't define or schematize our way out of very easily. And rather than sort of dispensing with it or trying to define it too much, we look for its value instead of kind of the constraints. So interaction is kind of usefully underdefined. So we could talk about all the following things that I've got up on the screen as interaction. So we might be tapping a touch screen, we might be posting on social media, we're interacting in some way. We might be being tracked by a geolocation system, we might be kind of living alongside technology and interacting with it, socially, physically, so on. It might be, as in Alex's example, hiring a bike and also interacting with networks of systems, of data, people and other objects, and so on. It seems kind of unlikely that we would confuse many people by talking about interaction in this multiplicity of ways. We all kind of get a sense that we can use interaction differently in different times and places to mean different things, and that's kind of okay. So in response, we can think about the concepts of interaction as promiscuous concepts. This is what we suggest in the paper. So they're about managing complex frictional relationships between diverse communities in HCI, which is kind of what I was talking about at the beginning with the prelude as to that there's these kind of lots of frictions, and actually there's some value in us having this sets of concepts which are kind of quite poorly defined in many ways. And there might be, thinking about interaction more positively and its complexities might help us retain a kind of some of our shared interest across HCI's complex set of communities, which are potentially often rubbing up quite strongly against each other epistemologically and everything else. And also there's some element in which sharing different notions of interaction can also potentially lead to greater generativity. So misunderstandings between people are potentially bad, but they can also generate clarifications and better understandings between all of us about the different senses in which we might mean interaction. And also, I'd just say, many sort of interesting concepts cease to be interesting when they're precisely defined, and doing so could potentially render them less useful anyway. And interaction, I think, is one of these things. So the last part is about, well, if we think about this, what do we do about it? What can we do about it? Can we solve anything or not? And I want to talk about not necessarily a solution, but a way of thinking about interaction in HCI. So I want to talk about therapeutic HCI, which is about living with the frictions that exist in HCI communities around a whole bunch of stuff, including these sorts of concepts. So just a kind of summary of what I'm trying to say is that interaction and the concept of interaction is not necessarily a resolvable matter for HCI. We can't necessarily define our way out of it or dispense with it. So just to clarify this, so definition and disciplining work, while potentially generative and kind of organizing schema of what we mean by interaction, will not necessarily solve this trouble, and also dispensing with it and abandoning the notions of interaction again could be generative, but they're not necessarily going to solve the problem either. So we're not proposing another solution, as I mentioned. Said we're proposing kind of a therapeutic attitude. And by therapeutic, I mean, I'll explain what I mean in a second. A therapeutic attitude to help live with HCI's frictions. So to do that, I want to turn to Wittgenstein, and I want to read out this quotation from Wittgenstein because it really leads to a explanation of what I mean by this kind of therapeutic attitude, because often Wittgenstein's talked about in terms of a kind of therapeutic attitude towards philosophy. It also links in with the philosophies of, or ordinary language philosophies of Ryle and also Austin. So Wittgenstein says here, the fundamental fact is that we lay down rules, a technique for playing a game, and that then, when we follow the rules, things don't turn out as we assumed. So we are, as it were, entangled in our own rules. And this entanglement in our own rules is what we want to understand, that is, to survey. So he has this nice idea about our entanglement in our own rules of our own construction, but actually that's what we want to understand and talk about, not that it's kind of necessarily resolvable. So to talk about interaction in this way, I want to think about how this kind of therapeutic approach to say, well, we can talk about the ways in which we mean interaction and what it does for us, not necessarily resolve it as a problem. So I'll talk about interaction, how it leverages various interaction words like response, as I've got listed here, react, alert, remind, interrupt, share, and detect. So interaction lets us talk about things in all these different kinds of ways, a very rich conceptual language, potentially. Now I've got some reading to do, I'm afraid, because this is actually from our paper. So I want to talk about what it might mean to have a kind of more therapeutic approach to thinking about interaction, and also how this kind of approach of looking at how we're entangled in our own rules about certain kinds of concepts actually might be generative or useful in some way. So I'll just read out this section of the paper. So returning to our family of affiliated interaction words, so response and react, there's a whole bunch of them that are connected with interaction, a whole rich language. Let's consider interrupt, a key interaction mechanism in HCI. What does interrupt mean specifically, and what might the different senses be for an app, an agent, personal device, an Internet of Things device or ecosystem, a social network recommendation, a friend's message, or an organization's call to action to interrupt us? What does it actually mean? So there are many senses in which we might make interrupt meaningful. So to say interrupt, we're talking about it in terms of being an affiliate associated concept with in notions of interaction. So there are many senses in which we might make interrupt meaningful, and it's likely that you, the reader, are constructing scenarios to make sense of interrupt yourself. Does it make sense to categorize a device and an IoT ecosystem as interrupting us in the same way? What about push notifications? Do they interrupt in the same way as a productivity app reminding us to get back to work? We can say a social network interrupts us to deliver a recommendation of some kind, but is this the sense of interruption? Is the sense of interruption the same as that produced by a message from a friend? When we say an agent interrupts someone, do we mean it in the same sense as an interruption on the street by a police officer? Something could be categorized as an interruption by an app designer, but treated as a welcome intervention, for example, by the receiver of that interruption. Overall, we might wonder what it means for us to use interaction as a frame within which to talk about interruptions as interactions that are generated or mediated by different kinds of technologies and different circumstances. Things which would ordinarily take much of their sense from mundane everyday sociality. When we examine the literature on interruption, it's often unclear what corresponding sense of interruption might be meant. For instance, we might point to, and this is actually referring to the special issue that the paper is in, might point to this issue edited by Jansen et al., in which something called self-interruption is subsumed into a general sense of interruption, a concept itself that is also left undifferentiated or textured. So I just want to conclude with a brief epilogue. If you want to, this is obviously just a flavour of the paper. So if you want to understand more about this kind of approach of talking through our problems with interaction, of which the interruption example I gave was one way of talking about it, one way of dealing with it. You can read a lot more in the paper about that. So it's kind of conclude, interaction and its families of languages and concepts are far more complex than any of the interaction debate is presently articulated. This is our view and why we wrote the paper, to actually kind of try and remind people that there's a huge richness to language, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We can think about a kind of a-therapeutic approach as a way to live with misunderstandings, confusions and conflations, but also resist urges to work toward resolving epistemic differences. That's what kind of this therapeutic approach is about. And it's, it relates to Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach to philosophy, which is that many of philosophy's problems they're created by philosophers. They're not necessarily there to resolve. They are the business itself of philosophy is not really to resolve anything. So we might kind of think about something like interaction in a similar kind of way, but also think, of course, how it's generative for us. So we can think about, for example, HCI's language of interaction and the concepts of interaction as a provocation to, for example, foreground and support the exploration of various conceptual confusions we have. I mean interrupt in this way and you mean it in some different way. To surface troubles of categorization. So one of the issues with interaction, of course, many other words that we use to describe interaction and in interaction affiliate words, is that the same words can mean different things, and that's okay. We can think about the language of interaction as a provocation to remind us of the play of metaphor. Interaction itself is a metaphor drawn from human interaction. So when we talk about interaction with machines and around machines, to what extent does that fit to the kind of what we normally think of as human interaction? Where are the kind of breaks and frictions in that? We can use it to foreground the prevalent leverage of mundane sensitive terms. That's kind of what I was just mentioning earlier. And also we can use this kind of discussion around interaction, unresolvable discussion around interaction, to expose us when we play fast and loose with meaning and concepts. So we can start to really interrogate, say, for example, what do you mean by interruption, and what senses are you using of interruption or interaction or all these other kind of interaction related words. That's the end of my talk. There's a bunch of references you might want to look at, including obviously this paper and some of the stuff I've mentioned earlier.